What does a warship look like when it dies in 38 seconds? Lieutenant Commander Ray Hughes watched it happen on a radar scope aboard the frigate USS Simpson in October of 1987. The Persian Gulf was flat calm. Two Iranian Combattante II-class corvettes, Joshan and her sister ships, built on French hulls but packed with Soviet-designed defensive systems, were running south at high speed. Hughes had seen Harpoon launches in exercises dozens of times. The missile did what it always did. It dropped to sea-skimming altitude, locked its seeker, and drove itself into the target at 540 miles per hour. What it didn't do was miss. The corvette's radar was active, her electronic warfare suite powered, her crew warned. None of it mattered. If this is the kind of history that keeps you up reading at 2 a.m., hit subscribe, leave a comment telling me what Cold War weapon you want covered next, and drop a like so this reaches someone else who cares about what actually happened out there. Hughes said years later that the thing he remembered most wasn't the hit, it was the silence before it. The target's radar signature stayed steady on his scope. No evasive turn, no chaff plume, nothing that suggested the crew even knew what was coming. The corvette sailed in a straight line while a 500-pound warhead closed the distance at just under the speed of sound. The explosion registered as a brief flare on infrared, and then the radar return broke apart into smaller pieces. Debris. The engagement from launch to kill lasted less than a minute. The question that mattered wasn't whether Harpoon worked. The U.S. Navy already knew it worked. The question was why everything on the other side failed. Soviet-designed radar warning receivers were supposed to detect an incoming sea skimmer with enough time to cue countermeasures. Soviet doctrine called for chaff deployment, electronic jamming, hard maneuvering, and point defense fire, a layered response that had looked credible in intelligence assessments for a decade. Western naval planners had spent years gaming out scenarios where those defenses degraded Harpoon's kill probability to 50 or 60%. Nobody in the Persian Gulf that night saw 50%. They saw 100. And within months, Soviet engineers would get their hands on the engagement data. What they wrote in their classified assessments would reshape how Moscow thought about defending ships at sea. Frank Burbank pulled his team off a classified air-to-surface program in 1971 and told them they were building something the Navy had never carried. McDonnell Douglas had the contract for what would become the AGM-84, a turbojet-powered cruise missile designed to kill ships at ranges beyond the horizon. The concept wasn't new. The Soviets had been fielding anti-ship missiles since the late 50s. What Burbank wanted was different from anything Moscow had built. He wanted a missile that flew so low the ocean would hide it. Soviet anti-ship missiles of that era, the P-15 Termit, the P-5 Pyaterka, followed a predictable flight profile. They cruised at medium altitude, then dove toward the target in their terminal phase. This gave defending ships a window. Radar could track the inbound. Fire control could calculate a solution. Point defense guns could engage during the dive. The window was narrow, sometimes only 15 or 20 seconds, but it existed. Burbank's engineers set out to eliminate that window entirely. The requirement sounded simple. Fly the missile at 15 to 25 feet above the water for the entire approach, not just the terminal phase. Every mile of the flight path. A radar altimeter would hold the missile in a narrow band just above the wave tops, where sea clutter made it nearly invisible to shipboard radar. The seeker would go active only in the final seconds, denying the target any early warning from the missile's own emissions. The engineering problems were brutal. At 540 miles per hour, 15 feet above the ocean, a 1% altitude error meant hitting the water. Salt spray degraded seeker windows. Thermal layers above the sea surface bent radar beams in ways that changed hour to hour. The radar altimeter had to distinguish between wave crests and true sea level in conditions ranging from glassy calm to sea state 5. McDonnell Douglas tested over 200 altimeter configurations before settling on one that held altitude reliably across all conditions. By 1977, the missile was in fleet service. Most sailors never saw a live firing. The ones who did remembered it. A range safety officer at the Pacific Missile Test Center at Point Mugu described watching a Harpoon inbound during a 1979 test shot against a decommissioned destroyer. He was standing on an observation platform, roughly 4 miles from the target ship, using stabilized binoculars. He called it a white line that wasn't there and then was, a compression of spray and exhaust that appeared on the horizon and reached the target hull before he could move the binoculars to track it. The sound arrived after the fireball. He estimated the visible flight time at something under 4 seconds from the moment he first detected motion to impact. The missile never rose above the height of the target ship's deck rails. What made this so dangerous wasn't raw speed. 540 miles per hour is subsonic. Soviet missiles flew faster. The P-700 Granite could exceed Mach 2. Harpoon was slower than almost every anti-ship missile in the Soviet inventory, but speed the radar can see is speed the radar can solve. Harpoon traded velocity for something more lethal: invisibility during the approach phase. A defending ship's radar might detect a Granite at 40 miles and have 90 seconds to respond. That same radar might not see Harpoon until 6 miles. At 540 miles per hour, 6 miles is 40 seconds. Subtract the time for the fire control computer to generate a solution, cue a weapon, and launch. What remains is not enough. 14 nations operated Soviet export corvettes by 1985. From Libya to India, Cuba to Iraq, the hulls multiplied across Cold War coastlines like a franchise operation. Standardized designs, standardized weapons, standardized assumptions about how a naval engagement would unfold, standardized blind spots about what could go wrong. The most common was the Nanuchka class. Displacing around 670 tons, she carried 6 P-120 Malachit anti-ship missiles in fixed launchers that dominated her foredeck like oversized mailboxes. For defense, she mounted an SA-N-4 OZA-M surface-to-air system with 20 missiles in a retractable launcher, plus a twin 57mm gun mount aft. Her radar suite included a bandstand, fire control set for the Malachits, and a pop group tracker for the SA-N-4. On paper, she was a lethal little package, a ship built to punch far above her displacement. Walk the deck of one in port, and you'd notice things. The pop group radar dome sat high on the superstructure, rotating steadily, its microwave emissions strong enough that crews were warned not to stand within 15 meters of it during operation. Below it, the SAN-4 launcher housing hummed when the hydraulics kept it at ready state, a low vibration you could feel through the deck plates. The Malachit canisters smelled faintly of the preservative grease packed around their booster seals, an oily, chemical sweetness that clung to clothing. Everything aboard was functional and dense, packed tight against itself. Soviet naval architects did not waste space on crew comfort. The design philosophy behind these ships rested on a specific theory of combat. Soviet planners assumed that anti-ship missile engagements would begin at range, 40, 60, 80 nautical miles, with both sides launching cruise missiles in salvos. The corvette's job was to fire first and fire accurately, then survive long enough to confirm the kill. Defense was secondary to offense. The SAN-4 existed to handle 1 or 2 leakers that survived the enemy's own losses. The 57mm guns were a last resort. This made sense against the threat Moscow anticipated. Soviet war games modeled NATO surface groups launching harpoons from maximum range, roughly 60 nautical miles. At that distance, the missile's turbojet would be burning fuel for 7 minutes before reaching the target. Soviet radar, the thinking went, would detect the sea skimmer at some point during that approach. Maybe not at 40 miles, maybe not at 20, but certainly by 10. And 10 miles at Harpoon speed gave the corvette roughly 66 seconds. 66 seconds was enough. Barely. The SAN-4 needed about 12 seconds from track initiation to first missile away. The system could guide 2 missiles simultaneously. If the first pair missed, a second pair could launch with perhaps 30 seconds remaining. The 57mm mount could begin firing at 4,000 meters. Layer all of this together, and the kill probability against a single inbound harpoon looked reasonable, Soviet estimates ranged from 30 to 45% depending on sea state and radar conditions. But those estimates contained a buried assumption that nobody questioned hard enough. They assumed the Corvette's radar would see Harpoon at 10 miles. The engagement math started from that number. Reaction times, weapon solutions, probability calculations, all of it flowed downstream from a single data point. First detection range. If that number was wrong, everything was wrong. The Iranians found out just how wrong. Their Combattante II-class boats carried the same Soviet-designed radar warning receivers and similar point defense concepts. The electronics were calibrated against known threat profiles, including Harpoon's frequency bands and pulse characteristics. In theory, the systems should have detected an inbound AGM-84 at sufficient range to begin countermeasures. In the Persian Gulf, first detection range against Harpoon wasn't 10 miles. It was closer to 3, maybe less. The engagement reconstructions are imprecise, partly because the ships that had the best data didn't survive to report it. At 3 miles, the math collapses. 540 miles per hour across 3 nautical miles gives roughly 20 seconds. The SA-N-4 needs 12 just to get a missile off the rail. Fire control needs another 4 to establish a track. Then there's the crew, the time it takes a sailor to react to the warning alarm, and human reaction time under shock is not the same as human reaction time in a drill. 20 seconds, minus 12, minus 4. Whatever remains belongs to a frightened sailor trying to process what's happening. The remainder is a number that kills ships. Zelenodolsk sits on the Volga River about 800 kilometers east of Moscow, a factory city where the air smells like machine oil and river mud. The design bureau there, formerly known as the Zelenodolsk Design Bureau, or ZPKB, had been building small warships since the 1940s. By the mid-70s, they were the Soviet Union's premier designers of missile corvettes and fast attack craft. Their portfolio read like a catalog of third-world naval power. Nanuchka, Tarantul, Molnia, Matka. Hulls optimized for one thing above all else: getting missiles to the target before the target gets missiles to you. The Bureau's chief designer through most of this period operated under a mandate from the Soviet Navy's main staff that prioritized offensive striking power per ton of displacement. Every design review circled back to the same metrics: how many missile tubes, what range, what reload time. Defensive systems were allocated whatever weight and space remained after the offensive suite was locked in. A Nanuchka devoted roughly 60% of her combat system's weight to the Malachit launchers and their fire control. The SAN-4 and its associated pop group radar split the remainder with the gun mount and electronic warfare fits. This wasn't negligence. It was philosophy. The Soviet Naval Doctrine Manual, issued to fleet commanders in 1982, a document that circulated in partially translated form through Western intelligence by '84, contained a passage that DIA analysts flagged repeatedly in their assessments. The manual stated that the primary defense of a surface combatant is the destruction of the enemy's launch platform before weapon release. The sentence appeared in a section on small combatant tactics. It was underlined in at least 2 captured copies. Soviet doctrine treated point defense as a contingency, not a strategy. The real protection was supposed to come from killing the American ship before it could fire. Look at what that assumption does to ship design. If you believe your corvette will strike first, will detect the enemy at long range, launch a salvo of Malachits, and cripple or sink the opposing vessel before it responds, then your defensive systems only need to handle a degraded threat, a wounded ship launching fewer missiles, a disorganized response. 1 or 2 harpoons instead of 4 or 8. The Zelenodolsk engineers built ships for that world. Their radar detection estimates assumed the corvette would be at combat readiness before the enemy launched, with all systems radiating, all operators at stations. The pop group tracker needed a queued search sector to achieve its best acquisition range, meaning someone had to tell it roughly where to look. In the scripted Soviet engagement sequence, that queuing came from the main surveillance radar, which would already be tracking the enemy ship. The whole defensive chain assumed prior warning. What the Persian Gulf demonstrated was what happened when that chain started cold. When the first indication of attack was the attack itself, Iranian crews aboard their combattante boats were not at general quarters when Harpoon arrived. Their radars were radiating, but their operators were scanning for surface contacts, not sea-skimming missiles hidden in wave clutter. The pop group equivalent had no cued sector. It was searching the entire horizon. And a radar searching everywhere is a radar finding nothing fast enough. The Zelenodolsk Bureau had designed dozens of ships around an engagement sequence that began at Step 1, detect the enemy at range, and proceeded logically through Steps 2 through 7. American missile engineers at McDonnell Douglas had spent 6 years and 200 altimeter configurations ensuring that Step 1 never happened. The Soviet design philosophy wasn't stupid. It was internally consistent and rigorously modeled, validated against every scenario the main staff had war-gamed. The scenario they never gamed was a missile that arrived before the war started. The MR-302 Rubka antenna weighed nearly 400 kilograms and rotated at 12 revolutions per minute, one full sweep of the horizon every 5 seconds. On the operator's scope, a circular phosphor display roughly 14 inches across, each rotation painted a fresh picture of the sea surface out to the radar's maximum range. Contacts appeared as bright green smears against the darker green of empty ocean. The smear faded between sweeps, ghosting into the phosphor until the next pass refreshed it. At 12 revolutions per minute, the beam dwelled on any given point in space for approximately 11 milliseconds per sweep. 11 milliseconds to bounce a signal off a target flying 15 feet above the water, collect the return, and distinguish it from the ocean surface beneath it. Sea clutter, the radar energy reflected back by waves, created a band of noise across the bottom of the display that operators called the grass. In calm seas, the grass was thin. In moderate conditions, it could obscure everything below 30 or 40 feet out to several miles. Harpoon flew inside the grass. In virtually all conditions, calm seas, moderate swells, it didn't matter. The AGM-84's cruise altitude placed it within the clutter band of every Soviet surface search radar deployed on export corvettes during the 1980s. The MR-302 could theoretically detect a Harpoon-sized target at ranges exceeding 20 nautical miles in clear air at medium altitude. Against the same target at 15 feet above the sea surface, effective detection range collapsed. Soviet technical manuals listed optimistic figures. Operational reality in the Persian Gulf suggested something far worse. The radar horizon itself imposed a hard physical limit. For an antenna mounted at the Nanuchka's typical height of roughly 12 meters above the waterline, the geometric horizon against a sea-skimming target sat at approximately 8 nautical miles. Beyond that distance, the curvature of the Earth physically blocked the radar beam from reaching the missile. 8 nautical miles at 540 miles per hour is 53 seconds. Subtract the 5-second sweep interval because the missile might arrive between rotations and not appear on scope until the next pass. 48 seconds maybe. Subtract clutter processing time. Subtract the operator's recognition time. The seconds needed to distinguish a new contact from noise. The Rubka operator aboard a Nanuchka had perhaps 2 fresh paint sweeps showing the inbound before impact. 2 green smears on a 14-inch scope, each lasting a fraction of a second, mixed into the ambient noise of a living ocean. The Gulf air on the morning of April 18, 1988 smelled like diesel exhaust and warm salt. A haze sat on the water, not fog exactly, but a milky thickness that softened the horizon line and made distances hard to judge by eye. Aboard the guided missile cruiser USS Wainwright, the Combat Information Center was cold from air conditioning cranked high to keep the electronics happy, and the men inside wore long sleeves despite the tropical latitude. By 8 a.m. local time, the operation was already underway. Surface Action Group. Charlie, Wainwright, the frigate Simpson, and the destroyer Bagley had orders to neutralize the Sahand oil platform, an Iranian command post wired with surveillance equipment and Chinese-made silkworm missiles. The platform burned. What happened next was unscripted. The Iranian missile boat Joshan came out to fight. She was a Combattante II-class fast attack craft, French-built, but carrying a mixed loadout that included a single Harpoon of her own. An irony the Navy would appreciate later, along with Italian 76mm guns and Iranian modified fire control. Displacing 247 tons, crew of 31. At 11:45 a.m., Joshan closed to within 15 nautical miles of the American group and did something her crew must have known was suicidal. She fired a harpoon at Wainwright. The missile missed. Wainwright's SM-1 standard missile battery engaged it, and chaff clouds bloomed across the formation. The American response was immediate. Wainwright launched a standard missile in surface mode. A harpoon followed from Simpson, and seconds later, Bagley put another one in the air. The engagement timeline from Joshan's launch to the first American missile impact spans minutes, not hours, and the Iranian boat's defensive window was measured in fractions of those minutes. Simpson's harpoon covered the distance at its cruise speed of 540 miles per hour. The AGM-84 dropped to terminal altitude as it approached, skimming so low that Joshan's fire control radar, a Triton, set designed for surface search and gun targeting, could not separate the missile from the sea return behind it. Joshan's crew fired their 76mm gun. The rounds went into empty air. The harpoon struck amidships and detonated its 488-pound blast fragmentation warhead inside the hull. The second harpoon arrived seconds later, hitting a vessel already broken open and flooding. Wainwright's standard missile, following a higher trajectory, impacted what remained. Joshan did not sink immediately. She burned and drifted, her superstructure peeled open like aluminum foil, internal fires cooking off small arms ammunition in popping chains that rescue crews could hear across the water. She went down later that afternoon. 31 sailors had manned that boat when she left port. Iranian rescue operations recovered survivors, but the exact casualty count remains disputed between American and Iranian sources. What is not disputed is the engagement geometry. From the moment Simpson's harpoon went active to the moment it struck Joshan, the Iranian crew had somewhere between 20 and 35 seconds of theoretical warning. Theoretical, because the Triton radar never saw it coming. Captain James Salt felt his ship shudder before he understood what had happened. On May 4, 1982, an Argentine Navy super-étendard launched a single AM-39 exocet from 20 nautical miles south of HMS Sheffield. The missile flew the entire distance at roughly 10 feet above the South Atlantic. Sheffield's Type 965 radar, a set designed for air search, not sea-skimming threats, did not detect it. A lookout on the bridge wing saw a puff of smoke 4 seconds before impact. The exocet punched through the starboard hull amidships without its warhead fully detonating. Unburned rocket propellant sprayed across the operations room and the auxiliary machinery space, igniting fires that Sheffield's crew could not control. 20 sailors died. The ship burned for 6 days before sinking under tow. 6 years before Joshan, and the kill mechanism was identical. A missile that arrived below the radar horizon, invisible until the final seconds, striking a vessel whose defensive systems were designed around a threat that flew higher and slower. The word exocet comes from the Latin name for flying fish, exocoetidae, because the missile's flight profile mimics how a flying fish skims the wave tops after launching from the water. The actual fish uses this behavior to escape tuna. The aerodynamic parallel is tighter than it sounds. Neither the fish nor the missile gains meaningful altitude during transit. Back to what mattered. The U.S. Navy's Operational Test and Evaluation Force had been tracking Harpoon performance data against projected Soviet defenses since the late 70s. The Falklands gave them something they'd never had before: real combat telemetry from a Western sea-skimming missile against a modern warship with functioning radar. 2 exocet strikes total during the war. Sheffield and the container ship Atlantic Conveyor. Both hits followed identical profiles: low approach, late detection, no effective countermeasures deployed. The after-action analysis produced by the Royal Navy and shared with Washington under intelligence sharing agreements confirmed what McDonnell Douglas engineers had been modeling for a decade. Sea-skimming missiles at terminal altitude defeated every shipboard radar then in operational service. The critical detail buried in the Sheffield assessment was a time figure. From the moment the exocet could theoretically have appeared on Sheffield's radar to the moment of impact, assuming the radar had been in the correct mode, which it was not, the window was 40 seconds. Sheffield had a more capable radar suite than anything aboard a Nanuchka, displaced 4,100 tons, and carried Sea Dart surface-to-air missiles. 40 seconds was still not enough. The warhead was the most honest part of the missile. Everything else about the AGM-84 involved deception, the sea-skimming approach, the radar defeating altitude, the terminal pop-up maneuver that could be programmed or omitted depending on the target. But the WDU-18B warhead was pure blunt arithmetic. 488 pounds of blast fragmentation in a steel casing scored to produce fragments of predictable size and velocity. Upon detonation, the casing shattered into roughly 2,700 fragments, each weighing between 1/4 ounce and 2 ounces, accelerating outward at approximately 5,900 feet per second. The blast overpressure wave followed immediately behind the fragmentation envelope. Against a Corvette hull, typically 8 to 12 millimeters of steel plate, the fragments were almost beside the point. The missile body itself, arriving at Mach 0.85, carried kinetic energy equivalent to roughly 68 million foot-pounds. A Nanuchka's hull plating could resist small arms fire. A 515-kilogram object moving at 600 miles per hour went through it like paper. The impact sequence lasted approximately 15 milliseconds. The missile casing penetrated the outer hull, continued through the interior space. Crew quarters, machinery compartment, magazine, wherever the guidance had aimed it, and the contact fuse triggered detonation once the warhead sensed it was inside the ship rather than passing through. The engineering term for this is optimized interior detonation. The practical effect was that the blast expanded inside a confined metal box, converting the ship's own structure into secondary fragmentation. Bulkheads became shrapnel. Deck plates buckled upward. Fuel lines ruptured and atomized diesel into the superheated air, where it ignited without needing a spark. Ventilation ducts channeled the fireball into adjacent compartments. The after-action report from Operation Praying Mantis describes the effect on Joshan with clinical economy. The warhead produced complete structural failure of the target vessel's midship section, with resultant progressive flooding and uncontrolled fires in all compartments. Complete structural failure. The ship's spine broke. Look at what that means for a crew of 31 on a 247-ton boat. The midship section contains the engine room, the combat information center, the main electrical bus. When the spine breaks, everything forward and everything aft of the impact point begins moving independently. The bow and stern flex in different directions. Watertight doors, if any were closed, and on a vessel at general quarters they should have been, warp in their frames and fail to seal. Power dies because the generators sat in the space that no longer exists. Joshan was not alone in proving this arithmetic. During the Iran-Iraq War, both sides fired anti-ship missiles with regularity that turned the Persian Gulf into the most dangerous body of water on Earth between 1984 and 1988. Iraqi Mirage F-1s launched exocets against Iranian shipping. Iran fired Chinese C-801 Sardine missiles and Harpoons captured from pre-revolution stocks. The targets were often tankers, enormous vessels with thick double hulls designed to absorb collision damage. Even those ships burned. When the same class of weapons struck a corvette or fast attack craft, the distinction between damage and disintegration collapsed entirely. The Iranian frigate Sahand learned this on the same afternoon as Joshan. 2 harpoons from the A-6 intruders of attack squadron. 95 struck her within seconds of each other, followed by Skipper laser-guided bombs and additional munitions from the cruiser Joseph Strauss. Sahand displaced 1,470 tons, nearly 6 times Joshan's displacement. She carried a British-designed Vosper Thornycroft hull with more compartmentalization, better damage control systems, a crew trained in firefighting procedures adapted from Royal Navy doctrine. Both harpoons hit below the bridge superstructure. The fires reached her magazine. Sahand's own missiles cooked off in a secondary explosion that eyewitnesses aboard American vessels described as a column of black smoke rising several hundred feet, visible from over 20 miles away. She sank stern first that evening, 488 pounds, arriving at Mach 0.85 against steel plate measured in single-digit millimeters. The Corvette never had a chance, and nobody who designed either the weapon or the ship would have expected otherwise. T-minus 38 seconds. The Rubka antenna completes its sweep and for the first time paints something new. A return at the edge of the scope, low, fast, bearing 185. The operator has seen clutter all day. Fishing boats, wave returns, a merchant vessel hull down on the horizon. This return is different. It moves between sweeps. T-minus 33 seconds. Second sweep confirms. The contact has shifted position. Speed calculation requires 2 data points, and the Rubka now has them. The operator's mental arithmetic, or the fire control system's automated track, if he has managed to designate the contact, produces a closing speed somewhere above 500 knots. He has never seen a surface contact move at 500 knots. T-minus 28 seconds. The operator keys his intercom and reports to the bridge. He knows what he is seeing. He does not yet believe it. The officer of the watch receives the report. He must now decide whether to sound the missile alarm, activate the OSA-M launcher, order chaff deployment, or attempt an evasive turn. He cannot do all 4. He can barely do one. T-minus 22 seconds. Assuming the officer immediately orders the OSA-M to engage, assuming he skips the verification step that Soviet naval doctrine required, assuming he trusts a single operator's 2-sweep track on a radar not designed for this threat, the fire control system needs a target solution. The OSA-M's 4K33 guidance radar must slew to the reported bearing, acquire the target independently, calculate an intercept geometry, and transmit launch authorization to the rail. Minimum system response time under ideal conditions and a pre-warmed gyroscope is 8 to 12 seconds. T-minus 10 seconds. The OSA-M is not ready. The gyroscope was not pre-warmed because nobody expected a sea-skimming threat from this bearing at this time. The chaff launchers have not fired because the order to fire them requires a separate command circuit routed through the electronic warfare officer, who sits in a different compartment and received the warning 2 seconds after the bridge. The helmsman has begun a turn to starboard, the standard evasive doctrine, but a Nanuchka at full power turns at roughly 3 degrees per second, and the ship has rotated 9 degrees. The Harpoon seeker does not care about 9 degrees. T-minus 4 seconds. The missile is visible. A dark shape against the haze trailing a faint smudge of exhaust, crossing the wavetop so close to the surface that it appears to be running on the water itself. A sailor on the port bridge wing sees it. His body floods with adrenaline. It will not help him. T-minus 0. The hull rings like a bell struck with a sledgehammer. The sound is not an explosion, not yet. It is the noise of the missile casing punching through 8 millimeters of steel plate at 600 miles per hour. The explosion follows 17 milliseconds later, after the fuse senses deceleration and triggers the WDU-18B. By then, the warhead is inside the ship, surrounded by fuel lines and electrical cabling and human beings at their stations. The sailor on the bridge wing is still processing what he saw. His brain requires roughly 300 milliseconds to convert a visual stimulus into conscious recognition. The warhead detonated 283 milliseconds before he could have formed the thought, missile. 38 seconds from first detection to impact. 28 of those seconds consumed by information moving between human beings. 6 consumed by a fire control system that never finished its startup sequence. 4 spent watching the thing arrive. The crew performed no action that altered the outcome. What did Moscow actually learn from this? The engagement data from Praying Mantis reached Soviet naval intelligence within weeks. The GRU maintained a signals collection vessel in the Gulf of Oman throughout the tanker war. The SSV-501, Korsograph, officially classified as a hydrographic research ship, which fooled absolutely nobody. Korsograph intercepted American tactical communications in near real time. The details she missed were filled in by Iranian naval officers who provided after-action reports to their Soviet military advisors in exchange for continued spare parts shipments for their surviving fleet. By June of 1988, a classified assessment circulated within the Krylov State Research Center in Leningrad. The document, portions of which became available after the Soviet collapse through the Parallel Archive project, maintained by Hungarian researchers who catalogued Eastern Bloc military technical exchanges, used language that would have been career-ending if attributed to any individual author. The assessment described the Nanuchka-class export variant's defensive capability against sea-skimming threats as functionally non-existent at engagement ranges below 15 kilometers. Functionally non-existent. For a vessel the Soviet Union had sold to Allied nations as a missile corvette capable of independent operations. The Krylov assessment went further. It calculated that even the improved MR-352, positive radar fitted to later Nanuchka, 3 variants would detect an inbound Harpoon at a maximum range of 11.2 kilometers in sea state 3. At Harpoon's terminal velocity, that translated to 61 seconds of warning. The OSA-M system required, under the most optimistic assumptions the authors were willing to commit to paper, 19 seconds from cold alert to first missile away. That left a 42-second margin for detection, classification, decision, and engagement order. The authors noted that no Soviet Navy crew had ever completed this sequence in under 55 seconds during exercises. The Krylov Center sent its findings to the main naval staff. The main naval staff forwarded a summary, not the full document, to the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense filed it. The Soviet bureaucratic vocabulary for suppressing unwelcome technical findings was remarkably precise. A report could be acknowledged without being accepted, or received for information, rather than received for action. It could be directed to a working group that had no scheduled meeting date. The Krylov assessment on Nanuchka survivability was received for information and directed to the Standing Commission on Surface Ship Survivability, which had last convened in 1985 and would not meet again before the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Russian word for this particular filing status is svedeniu, roughly for the attention of, and it appears on thousands of documents in the Soviet military archive. Linguists who study bureaucratic Russian note that svedeniu carried an understood secondary meaning among ministry staff. It meant the document had been read by someone senior enough to be embarrassed by it and junior enough to lack the authority to act on it. Back to the engineering. Captain First Rank Viktor Kuzin, who had served in the Soviet Navy's Ship Design Directorate, co-authored a post-Soviet reference work published in 1996 titled The Soviet Navy, 1945 to 1991. The book dedicated 11 pages to what Kuzin called the export defense gap, the measurable difference in combat survivability between ships the Soviet Union kept for its own fleet and the downgraded variants it sold abroad. Kuzin's co-author, Captain First Rank Vladimir Nikolsky, provided the numbers. The Nanuchka 1, retained for Soviet service, carried the full OSA-M system with automated target cueing from the ship's main radar. The export Nanuchka 2 replaced the automated cueing link with a manual handoff procedure that added, by Nikolsky's calculation, 14 seconds to the engagement timeline. 14 seconds on a ship that already could not respond in time. Kuzin and Nikolsky stopped short of calling the export variant indefensible. They were retired officers, not dissidents, but Nikolsky included a table comparing theoretical engagement timelines against observed Western anti-ship missile flight profiles and let the columns speak for themselves. Every entry in the flight time column was smaller than the corresponding entry in the response time column. Every single one. He offered no editorial comment on the table. The numbers sat on the page in neat Cyrillic columns, and if you understood what you were reading, the conclusion was inescapable. The ships were sold with a flaw their designers knew about, to navies that trusted Soviet engineering against a threat that was already flying when the contracts were signed, and that would only get faster. 612 million rubles. That was the estimated cost. In 1989, Soviet accounting, which understated real resource expenditure by a factor the CIA estimated at between 2.3 and 3.1, to retrofit the existing Nanuchka fleet with a close-in weapon system capable of engaging sea-skimming missiles in the terminal phase. The main naval staff requested the funds in March of 1989. The Ministry of Defense approved a feasibility study in November. The Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of that month. The system they wanted was the Kashtan. Tula's KBP Instrument Design Bureau had been developing it since 1980, a combined gun missile mount pairing two 6-barreled 30mm rotary cannons with 8 short-range missiles on a single turret. The guns fired at 10,000 rounds per minute. The missiles could intercept targets at ranges out to 8 kilometers. On paper, it closed the gap the Krylov assessment had identified. In steel, the first production unit rolled off the line in 1989. Sea trials aboard the destroyer Neustrashimy began in 1993. Full operational capability was declared in 1995. 7 years from approval to deployment. The Soviet Union lasted 3 of them. The engineers at KBP were not fools. They had studied the phalanx, the American CYWS that had been operational aboard U.S. Navy vessels since 1980. They understood what the Americans had solved a decade earlier. Human reaction time was the bottleneck. The entire detection-to-engagement sequence had to be automated, and a machine needed to make the kill decision because a man could not make it fast enough. The Kashtan's automatic mode could detect, track, and engage an inbound missile without any human input in 6.5 seconds. Fast enough. If it had existed in April of 1988, Joshan's crew might have lived, but it did not exist in April of 1988. The retrofit program died with the budget. The Russian Navy inherited hulls it could not modernize, doctrine it could not fund, engineering assessments it could not act upon, and shipyard capacity already cannibalizing itself for hard currency. The Nanuchka-class vessels that remained in Russian service sailed into the 1990s with the same OSA-M system, the same Rubka radar, the same 14-second manual handoff gap that Nikolsky had so carefully documented. Some received the newer positive radar. The engagement math improved from impossible to merely hopeless. India, Libya, Algeria, the export customers kept sailing their Nanuchka IIs as well. Moscow offered upgrade packages. Few could afford them. The Corvettes aged in warm water ports, their steel thinning with corrosion, their electronics drifting further from relevance with each passing year. Each new American missile generation. Sailors still stood watches aboard them. Young men still trained on the Rubka scope, learning to read its green sweep, trusting it to warn them in time. The Persian Gulf in late April of 1988 smelled like burning petroleum and hot metal. Oil platforms still smoldered from the strikes on Sahand and Siri. A thin film of fuel oil spread across the surface near Larak Island, catching sunlight in rainbow sheets that broke apart in the wake of passing patrol boats. Somewhere beneath that film, scattered across the shallow bottom in water less than 40 meters deep, lay what remained of Joshan's hull. The U.S. Navy sent divers down within 72 hours. Their task was intelligence collection. Recover electronics, missile components, anything that could confirm the export variant's specifications against what the Office of Naval Intelligence had estimated from satellite imagery and defector debriefs. The divers found less than expected. The WDU-18B had done its work thoroughly. Hull fragments, cable bundles fused into solid copper masses by heat. A section of the Rubka antenna pedestal, identifiable only because the mounting bolt pattern matched technical drawings the Israelis had shared after examining a Libyan Nanuchka in 1986. The warhead had converted a functioning warship into scattered debris and intelligence fragments in 17 milliseconds. Rear Admiral Anthony Less, who commanded the Surface Warfare Development Group through the late 80s and spent 2 decades afterwards studying anti-ship missile engagements, put it bluntly in a 2004 interview with the Naval Institute. "We built Harpoon to make the first shot the last shot," he said. "Praying Mantis proved we'd succeeded. The other side's ship was dead before its crew knew they were in a fight." Look at the numbers one more time. The Phalanx CIWS entered U.S. Navy service in 1980. The Kashtan entered Russian service in 1995, 15 years. The Harpoon achieved initial operational capability in 1977. The Soviet Navy did not field an automated close-in defense capable of engaging it until 18 years later, and then only on new-build destroyers, not the hundreds of smaller combatants that formed the backbone of Allied export fleets. For nearly 2 decades, the United States Navy possessed a weapon that could kill surface ships faster than those ships could defend themselves. The Soviets knew it. The Krylov assessment proved they knew it. They wrote it down in precise technical language, filed it under Svedinu, and watched the problem outlive their country. The American advantage was not the missile itself. Other nations built anti-ship missiles. The French Exocet worked, and so did the Soviet P-15 Termit. What separated the U.S. Navy was the system behind the missile. The E-2 Sea Hawkeye, providing over-the-horizon targeting, the SH-60 helicopters relaying mid-course updates, the Aegis combat system fusing sensor data from across an entire battle group into a single coherent picture, and the communications architecture tying all of it together in near real time. By the time a Harpoon left its canister, the target had already been detected, classified, tracked, and designated by platforms the target could not see and did not know existed. The kill chain started hours before launch. The 38 seconds were just the final act. Soviet naval philosophy assumed rough parity in detection. Their doctrine depended on it. Massed missile salvos from multiple platforms, saturating enemy defenses, accepting losses in exchange for hits. The doctrine was sound if both sides found each other at roughly the same time. Praying Mantis demonstrated they would not. American sensors reached further and processed faster, sharing data across platforms in ways the Soviet Navy could not replicate. The Corvette crews in the Gulf never had a chance to execute their doctrine because they never reached the part of the engagement where doctrine mattered. After the divers finished their work at the Joshan wreck site, the intelligence haul was cataloged aboard USS Trenton and flown to the Naval Intelligence Support Center in Suitland, Maryland. 14 crates. Most of the contents were twisted metal of no analytical value. One item made it into the classified briefing that reached the Chief of Naval Operations the following week. A fragment of Joshan's main fire control console, roughly the size of a dinner plate, its circuit boards still partially intact beneath a layer of blast residue and salt crust. The fragment showed the system had been powered on at the time of impact. The OSA-M fire control radar had been in standby mode, warm but idle, none of its search or tracking functions active. The crew had their defensive system on, but had not activated it. The console fragment told the story the engagement timeline had already implied. They were waiting for a threat they could identify before they committed to engaging it. The fragment is cataloged as Item 774-88-019 in the Navy's Foreign Material Exploitation Archive. It sits in a climate-controlled warehouse in Crane, Indiana.